Hi, everybody, and boy, I've got a big one for you today, so you might want to buckle up. Every so often, I talk about kind of INFJ, INFP relations, and I'd say once every year or two, I kind of get back into another interpretation of what's going on. Clay Arnall, an INFJ who has a YouTube channel with many followers, has very recently dropped a video about why people like, dislike, or do people like, dislike, misunderstand INFJs. And it's getting a ton of views, lots of comments, lots of engagement. It's all great. I am happy to be in my little corner as a remote observer. The thing about this is that Clay speaks in turn, and he speaks fairly about both how he sees or believes INFJs are generally perceived by other types, but also then about some of the reasons why NFJs kind of garner that perception. That said, he has summaries for SPs and their potential negative interpretations, SJs, and those incompatibilities, and then a series with FI users, and in particular NFPs, and what sort of issues that FI has with INFJs, or INFJs have with FI, and vice versa. And before I proceed, I should say there's a couple of background notes. One is that I firmly believe that Clay Arnall is an INFJ. That is, has the NiFeTiSe cognitive stack. That being said, I'm not going to make any judgment calls about who is or isn't INFJs or INFPs, other than in the limited scope of what I'm going to talk about here. And then also, I need to bring out a premise that people make the assumption because NI is knowing, it's concision, it's collapsing, and visions and realization, that NI is always correct. This is not necessarily the case, the same way that SI is not always correct. Furthermore, even if we have the idea that NI is correct, NI, like NE, is not, because it is linked to the subconscious, it is not under our full control to manage or to choose to perceive in particular areas. In addition to that, the visions, concision, the product of NI perception is a raw perceived material. It is not. It's then up to the INFJ to interpret and process that how they will. The reason I'm dancing around this is to say NI knows when it sees something. It's an interpretation that that thing that it has perceived is FI. It's an interpretation that that particular pattern is what would be referred to under common agreement as INFP. So a long way of explaining, NI may do things correctly. The interpretation of meaning from the perception of NI, even if it perceives things correctly, is not necessarily correct. And I'm hoping that we can kind of lay these ground rules, or at least come to a common agreement that this is the case. Anyway, when Clay talks about these things, like I said, he's pretty equivocal about where people come up with reasons they might dislike INFJs, but also why INFJs may have cause to be disliked by these other types. And what I saw on the surface of it is, yes, there's a lot of call upon TI rationality, logic. Clay really digs into that. And that's kind of part of what helped decode what I hope might be a new revelation here. But there's multiple things happening at multiple levels in this video. The first is to take it at surface level, to take Clay at his word. When that happens, there are a number of claims that I would say are either incorrect or contestable that he makes, states as fact. That's less important. What's more important is that there are positions that seemingly, when you take them as a whole of the conversation, are incongruent. They're potentially contradictory. And what I see there is that there's these rule sets, like rules for thee but not for me, that he's looking at things from a perspective of, here is how I approach and engage with others. Here's kind of the way that an INFJ's mind, with mine as an example, work. And it is rather, or potentially rather, unforgiving, where the expectation toward the INFJ is that others should, that others, if they were to like the INFJ, should kind of capitulate to the INFJ's, basically do stuff that they want them to do without feeling the requirement to do the same necessarily for others. But there is, part of this is not necessarily a real issue because different types do different things. So what an INFJ may do for others doesn't have an equivalent return. There's a different payoff, like a barter system between types, that I give you 2 mules, you give me a bag of grain, because you have I have mules and you have grain. So this system of exchange is fair, but it does seem as if there's incongruencies in the expectation of the value and the approach to which other types should come to the table, and how an INFJ would look at, can regard these things and should rule on these things. Long way of saying, I think there's errors, but when I look at the at the engagement, it's like, okay, you saw how long this preamble has been already. Nobody cares to listen to me write 3 pages of commentary. No one's got the patience. Nobody cares. Nobody wants to hear it on that site. So I do what I would usually do, which is keep my mouth shut, because yes, stuff is contradictory. It's too much time and effort for me to lay it all out. There's no value in it for anybody, including myself, except to frustrate others, potentially make them angry, and then dump a whole lot on me. So surface level, incongruencies, let's live with that. Let's go one level below that, because that's where things start to get more interesting. The motivations for this topic and the impact. And I don't describe any deeper motivations to like dark motivations to this or having an agenda. I think it was just Clay looking at a particular subject, being like, this is something I can work with, and these are things which will resonate with others. Having that spectacular NiFe capability, these are things that will resonate with others that I should bring out for a video that'll be seen by a lot of people, and they will respond accordingly with engagement and so on and so forth. So, pretty simple reason for engaging. The interesting thing being that I think at a point he sort of says, look, I'm being honest with you. This is all straightforward. I'm being authentic. I'm taking off the mask. I'm showing you how it is. Well, yes and no. What we're looking at is a Pian Yan mask dancer. So it's kind of a different sort of theater where you take off one mask to expose another mask. And it's not as if this is anything, again, it's not a bad agenda. It's not for any evil purposes. I would say right now, I carry a mask in the way that I present myself and talk about this stuff. We all have these different contexts and interpretations of ourselves. So it's not as if, I don't think that there's anything bad that he's trying to do. But to say, I'm taking off the mask and this is my authentic self is like, well, yeah, it's a masquerade ball. This is not really correct. Not that anyone's being inauthentic, but the intent is still image management. When FE is going to be intrinsic into whatever an INFJ does. And when there's the statement of saying, I'm going to take the mask off and just tell it like it is, there's a reason for that. And there's an image management reason for that. So it's like, it's just well played. I have no beef with this. I just want to kind of say it as it is. And then let's go one level below this, because that's where things really get interesting. And that is, look at the INFJ cognitive functions and the frame, and suddenly this reason why INFJs have this kind of thing in their craw about INFPs starts to make sense. And that is, the third function is for an INFJ is Ti. And if there's one thing about that tertiary function that neo-Jungians generally agree upon, is that that's your child function. It's the one you want to develop. It's the one that you lean into because it's the big payoff. Because your dominant function, you just do. You know it. It's been with you all your life. Your auxiliary function, that's your primary tool for how to engage with your dominant, and the two go side by side. But that third function is kind of like, here's the place where I get to shine and I can show off in a childlike way. And for an INFP, that's SI. In my own way, I would say for me, the child function is that I love the idea of like being wrapped in a cozy blanket, a cup of hot chocolate, thinking about some nostalgic thing, or like just sort of have some good feelings with a good experience, with some nostalgia, and just be able to do stuff without requiring any expenditure of energy levels. That's a payoff. It's just this sort of slothful self that wants to engage in kind of the ultimate self-care. INTPs are not that different. But for INFJs, the third slot is introverted thinking. And Clay was intentionally leaning into the importance of introverted thinking. And yes, it's important, but it's also third slot, meaning it's actually not very good. And this is probably going to cause some controversy, but I'll bring you to an analogy with the ISTJ. ISTJs have third slot FI, and I think I've observed in the past that third slot FI, the difference between first and third, so an ISFP or INFP versus an INTJ or ISTJ through FI, is that third slot FI is precious for an ISTJ. It is a place of kind of pride, and it's a place where there's not a lot of granularity. It's used in kind of a childlike way, but that means you sort of engage with it, you make a value decision, and then you stick with it because that's it. It kind of loads into the rest of the system. And for an ISTJ, FI values are, or an INTJ FI values are really important. They're internal, they're precious. Whereas for an INFP, it's sort of like, well, I evaluate. Values are not something to be statically established and then enforced. This is for Fi dominant. Evaluation is what's interesting. And for an INFP in particular, continuous reevaluation and clarification and reapproaching this topic is what's interesting. Very similar to an INTP in that regard. To tinker and play and look at things this way and that and kind of flip it many different ways and see how to rational out the most correct outcome, with the engagement with the idea being the fulfillment as opposed to the solution of it. So as the ISTJ with Fi kind of fires and forgets with lower granularity and then establishes something and then kind of sets it into place and enforces it, well, what do you get with someone with third slot Ti? Very similarly, they're going to have lower granularity. They're going to use it to make an evaluation and with a childlike way, going to have lower granularity, and then set that evaluation into place and cement it in, because that is a place where things get done and then are done, as opposed to the thing that you are constantly doing with your dominant or auxiliary. So what does that translate into? A strong third slot introverted judging translates into a strong interpretation of I am right because I've done the inner work and this is correct. And that's what we see. You combine that with Ni, and the concision, singularity, collapsing of vision, and then marry that to Ti, which basically looks at stuff, makes a decision, and then locks in hard. And then add to that Fe, that capability to interface and influence and be aware of the social dynamic and work the social fabric. And that's where you get this idea that INFJs think that INFPs are a particular thing that they're not. Now, to go to the reason why this is so, why they kind of mislock into believing that Fi users are INFPs when they're probably not, is first that, and again, this will be a place of disagreement, I believe that INFPs are not all that more common than INFJs. So there just aren't many. But then the issue is that we are also opposite cognitive functions. So it is potentially hard to recognize someone who's using the fully opposite set of cognitive functions. You may find people that irritate you and then just decide, well, that must be because our cognition doesn't match. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're an INFP. It could just be, alpha and delta quadra, delta and gamma beta and delta quadra. Anyway, just the difference in all cognitive functions. What I believe then happens is that Fi is an internal facing process. Jung himself has, in describing this more than a century ago, pretty much described, I think it accurately, that the Fi dominant is just sort of closed and inscrutable. There's just a whole lot that goes on and you can't really see what's happening. It's below the waterline. Any ideation ties to Fi. So both of those functions go below the waterline. Then Si draws upon the past, experiential reference. So now you've got three functions, all of which go below the waterline. So what you get is, as Dario Nardi talked about, somebody who engages primarily through listening. And when somebody's doing a lot of listening and they're not saying very much, then how do you tell that that person is an FI user? The answer is, if you don't have any of those functions and you're not familiar with this instantiation of the stack, you don't know it, especially if it's not common. Therefore, I think what's happening is INFJs view FI being executed and therefore figure, well, this is a type of FI, must be INFP. And then you add in the whole confusion between 16 personalities and people self-assessing and a lot of misnomers about what different types look like, and INFPs not necessarily doing much to dispel any of those notions, because it's like, okay, that creates, I think, in a lot of INFJs' minds, the idea that this is an INFP, somebody who at the Thanksgiving dinner table calls Joe an immoral pig. Well, that must be the highest level of FI, and therefore an INFP. In the meantime, this thinking doesn't leave a lot of room for people like myself and the people that I believe are INFPs, who are listeners. They would rarely express themselves in this sort of forthright way, with a possible exception. I mean, there's always a chance to press somebody into a corner where they're going to return fire because they've been given no other option. But typically what you will see with an INFP, I believe, when you're looking at the right thing, is someone who does a lot of listening and then just kind of sits back and doesn't say or do very much. And then you get this 20 minutes of pedantic discussion that gives everyone a headache and nobody cares if you drag that out of them in the first place. I'm not sure if I'm even going to post this, to be honest. Mainly, I needed to put these thoughts together for myself because I wanted to get an understanding. And I think this has helped me take another step forward in understanding why there are these misunderstandings between INFJ and INFP personality types. The way that you can tell an INFP is that 90% of the time, if you draw out of them, what is your opinion on this particular thing? If you manage to draw it out of them, it might be a very long and complicated discussion. It's not going to be calling Joe an immoral pig. And if you choose to ignore or tell them that their view is wrong, again, most of the time you're going to get a okay, because FI doesn't universalize. So if you have a different way of thinking, then, and it is a rational way of thinking, then there's nothing to stop you from having your belief. Just like there's nothing to stop reprehensible Uncle Joe from saying whatever Uncle Joe is going to say. In fact, going back to Jung, and I'll quote here one of the statements about introverted feeling, because this, I think, explains the actual nature of what to look for with an INFP. And I quote, "The relationship is, as far as possible, kept in a secured, tranquil middle state of feeling, where passion and its intemperateness are resolutely prescribed." So basically, the idea is to take someone from outside and their views, hold them at a particular safe distance, and then examine those positions for useful parts. stripped for parts to use for internal learnings. So Uncle Joe saying reprehensible things, yeah, that's Uncle Joe. Let's not me be like Uncle Joe, but I can see aspects of Uncle Joe in myself. And the extent to which it's helpful for me to learn what makes Uncle Joe and for me to ingest that and understand it is important for my own long-term development, I suppose. So going back, there is an INFJ typologist, an expert, who once upon a time mentioned that out of all of the types, this person found INFPs the most difficult one to type because they are, well, just because they look like so many other types. And I believe it's because listening tends to be much more typical. And so someone who's listening is not displaying any external functions. And when they do respond, they may respond in ways that look like other types. Until you get to this sort of a opening of the cloak and the 30-minute kind of dialogue going into these finer points off the cuff, you don't really know if you're dealing with an INFP, particularly if you don't have any of those same functions. So, to wrap up, so what do I think of INFJs? Well, there aren't many that I know, and I think of them as individuals. So my view on them is not anything conclusive. There are, I would say, there's at least one or two that I think are precious and important to this world, and whatever can be done to help encourage, foster, support, these things would be important. Then there are other INFJs who are doing quite well for themselves. It appears to me like Clay Arnall is one of those. So I don't see that for most INFJs that there's anything that is required from me. And also, I'm not certain if there's anything that I can provide them that would be of value. So I have an inconclusive view and would say I'd approach each one and just see what they're all about. Having a different view to me is interesting. That's what MBTI is all about. So having someone who has all opposite functions, who's trying to accomplish the same goals with those opposing functions, is rather interesting to me, at least in an abstract sense. Anyway, the main takeaway here is just to say, if you are an INFP and you see all of this stuff about INFJs, certain INFJ voices disparaging INFPs in particular, it seems like that's the one that comes out, realize that INFJs have third slot TI and it is not great. It's a source of pride and it's good enough for a lot of things, but that NITI is not necessarily reaching the right conclusions. And so, and in the meantime, there's also this need to be correct for an INFJ. So sympathy and letting an INFJ believe what they wish to believe generally is probably the best way to go. I mean, I see no reason to start arguments because we are simply going to talk past each other. And for instance, the points that I see with Clay Arnall that I would say are incongruent. If we were to have that discussion, I would suppose that this would be brought to a TI frame to try and claim that what appears to be incongruent is not really incongruent. And why would I want to even have that discussion? It is not, there is no value to be had in it. So the takeaway is just let INFJs be INFJs and hope that they do good in the world. And if they don't, well, who gets a chance to really do good in the world? So in the end, we need to mind our own shop and see if we can do good in the world. I provide, in order to avoid hypocrisy, I would say, speaking for myself, I provide no guarantees. So anyway, that is more than long enough. And if you're still listening, oh, God help you, thank you. But if you wish to leave a comment, please feel free. I expect people to disagree, and I expect that people will be, I respect the disagreement, and I may potentially be wrong on a number of things here. But I think it is kind of a further step over the years of understanding INFJs to getting closer to why there is this odd failure to connect between the types that seems to happen commonly. That's it. Thanks, everyone, and a good morning, afternoon, evening, night, mid-morning, brunch, late tea, midnight snack, wherever you may be.